Abdul! Abdul! Mama called out from her corner of the little mud house, her voice trembling with both pain and longing. Please, help me with my crutches. I need to use the bathroom. Abdul, sitting lazily under the mango tree outside, pretended not to hear her. His headphones blared loud music as he sipped from a sachet of cold water. Inside, his crippled mother struggled to drag herself across the dusty floor, tears streaming down her face. Abdul's cold heart had long grown immune to her suffering. He didn't just hate her, he resented her very existence. To him, her disability was a burden that shamed him in front of the world. Mama, paralyzed from the waist down after a terrible accident 10 years ago, had always tried her best. She sold vegetables in the village market, enduring insults and stares just to ensure Abdul had food to eat. But no matter what she did, it was never enough for Abdul. He despised her crippled legs and her crawling movements. To him, she was a disgrace, and he wished she would just disappear. Late that evening, Mama was in the kitchen, bent over her small firewood stove. Her weak arms stirred the bubbling pot of soup with difficulty, the scent of agusi and smoked fish filling the air. She knew Abdul would refuse to eat her food as usual, but she still cooked, hoping one day he'd change. Unknown to her, Abdul had been waiting for this moment. As soon as she dragged herself to her room to rest, Abdul sneaked into the kitchen. He stood over the steaming pot, his face twisted with disgust. This woman is useless, he muttered to himself, pulling down the waistband of his trousers. With a wicked smirk, he urinated into the pot of soup. When Mama returned to the kitchen later that night, she served herself a small portion of the soup. As she tasted it, her face froze. Something wasn't right. The taste was off, bitter, salty, and strange. She looked at the pot, then at Abdul, who was now lounging on the old bamboo chair, scrolling on his phone. Her heart sank, but she said nothing. The next morning, Mama asked him calmly, Abdul, did you do anything to the soup last night? Abdul didn't even bother to look at her. What if I did? He replied coldly. Mama's eyes filled with tears. She had always suspected Abdul's hatred for her, but this was beyond her imagination. She clasped her trembling hands together and prayed silently, asking God to touch his heart. Days turned into weeks, and Abdul's behavior only worsened. Whenever Mama crawled outside to sit under the shade, the villagers would shake their heads in pity. That poor woman, they whispered. Her own son doesn't even respect her. May God help her. One Sunday morning, Mama decided to go to church. She hadn't been in years because it was difficult for her to get there. But something in her spirit told her she needed to pray. She begged Abdul to help her get dressed and wheel her to the church. Abdul scoffed. You want me to push you to church so people will laugh at me? Never, he shouted. Mama didn't argue. Slowly, painfully, she crawled out of the house and began dragging herself down the dusty road. Neighbors stood in shock as they watched her inch her way to the church, her face dripping with sweat and her hands caked with dirt. Abdul stood by the door, watching her with a smirk. At church, Mama prayed fervently. She cried out to God, her voice shaking. Father, I have tried. I don't know what else to do. Please, touch my son's heart. Don't let him end up destroying his life. Her tears soaked the church floor as the congregation prayed with her. Meanwhile, back at home, Abdul was busy ransacking Mama's old wooden box. He was looking for money, hoping she'd hidden some from her petty vegetable sales. This woman must have something hidden here, he grumbled, throwing her belongings around. Suddenly, his hand touched an old photograph. It was a picture of a younger Mama, standing tall and smiling, holding a baby, him. She looked so happy, full of life and hope. Abdul stared at the photo for a moment, something stirring in his heart, but he quickly shoved it away. What's the point of looking at the past? He muttered, tossing the picture aside. When Mama returned from church hours later, she found her things scattered all over the room. She said nothing, only gathered her belongings and sat quietly in her corner. Abdul didn't even look at her. That night, Abdul had a strange dream. He was in a dark forest, surrounded by whispering voices. Why do you hate your mother? The voices asked, echoing in his ears. Do you not know what she has sacrificed for you? In the dream, Abdul saw a vision of his mother from years ago. He saw her running to save him from a speeding car, the moment she pushed him out of harm's way but got hit herself. That was how she lost her legs. Abdul woke up sweating, his heart pounding. He sat up on the bed, staring into the darkness. But as the morning came, his hardened heart returned. He shrugged off the dream, convincing himself it was nothing. The next day, Mama decided to confront Abdul. "My son," she began, her voice steady but filled with pain, "why do you hate me so much? What did I do to deserve this?" Abdul rolled his eyes. "You're a burden," he said bluntly. "Every time people see me, they ask, is that not the son of the crippled woman? I'm tired of the shame." Mama's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. She wanted to tell him about the accident, about how she sacrificed her legs to save his life. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she crawled back to her corner, silently weeping. That night, something unexpected happened. A loud knock came at the door. Abdul, annoyed, got up to open it. Standing there was a man dressed in white, his face glowing strangely in the moonlight. The man looked at Abdul and said, "You have despised the one who gave you life. Now, you will face the truth." Before Abdul could respond, the man stepped inside and pointed at Mama, who was trembling in her corner. "Tell him the truth," the man commanded. Mama's lips quivered as she looked at Abdul. "The truth," she whispered. What truth was the man talking about? Abdul's heart began to race. The air in the room grew heavy, and he felt a cold chill run down his spine. Mama's eyes glistened with tears as she gazed at Abdul, the words she had held back for years now clawing their way to the surface. Her frail body trembled as she began to speak. "Abdul," she said softly, her voice trembling, "I have never told you this because I didn't want you to carry the burden of guilt. But since you hate me so much, you deserve to know the truth." Abdul crossed his arms, his face blank. "What truth? What story are you trying to cook up now, Mama?" She swallowed hard, her hands clutching the edge of the mat she sat on. "The reason I can no longer walk, the reason I lost my legs. It was because of you." Abdul's brows furrowed. "What nonsense are you saying?" he asked coldly. Mama's voice broke as she continued, 10 years ago, we were walking back from the market. You were just a little boy, holding my hand. You loved playing in the streets, always running ahead of me. That day, a car came speeding toward us. I shouted for you to stop, but you didn't listen. I ran after you, Abdul. I threw myself in front of that car to push you out of the way. I didn't think twice about it. I only wanted to save you. And I did. Abdul's arms dropped to his sides as her words sank in. Mama lifted her worn-out wrapper, revealing the deep scars on her legs, a haunting reminder of the accident. This is why I can no longer walk. This is why I crawl. I sacrificed my legs for you, Abdul. If I could go back, I'd do it again, no matter how much you hate me now. The room was silent, except for Mama's quiet sobs. The man in white, who had been standing silently in the corner, took a step forward. His piercing eyes bore into Abdul's. Now you know the truth, the man said, his voice echoing in the small room. What will you do with it? Abdul opened his mouth to speak, but before he could utter a word, the man turned and walked out through the door. His figure dissolved into thin air, leaving behind a strange chill in the room. Abdul staggered backward, his heart racing. He turned to his mother, his face contorted with fear and anger. What? What was that? He shouted. Mama shook her head, her tears still falling. I don't know who he was, she said honestly. But maybe God sent him to open your eyes, Abdul. Abdul's fear quickly turned to rage. He pointed a trembling finger at her. You're behind this, aren't you? You've been doing charms to control me. That man was one of your juju people. Mama's eyes widened in shock. Charms? Juju? Abdul, I would never. Stop lying. Abdul shouted, his voice breaking. I knew it. I knew there was something wrong with you. You crippled witch. Before Mama could respond, Abdul stormed into the tiny room they shared, grabbed a few of his clothes, and stuffed them into a bag. He moved with urgency, like a man being chased by invisible spirits. Abdul, please don't go. Mama cried, dragging herself toward him. Where will you go in the middle of the night? Please, my son. But Abdul was deaf to her pleas. He slung the bag over his shoulder and pushed past her. I'm leaving. I can't stay in this house with you and your evil spirit. Mama clung to his leg, her crippled body sprawled on the floor. Please, Abdul. I'm all you have. Don't leave me like this. Please, my son. Abdul kicked her hand away, his face twisted with disdain. You're not my mother, he spat. You're a curse. With those words, Abdul stormed out of the house, slamming the wooden door behind him. Mama lay on the floor, her heart shattered into pieces. She screamed his name into the night, but the only response was the distant sound of his footsteps fading away. Abdul wandered through the village, his mind racing. The man in white, his mother's story, the scars on her legs, it was too much for him to process. He didn't want to believe it. He refused to believe it. As he walked down the deserted road, the cold night air bit into his skin. He tried to shake off the strange feeling that someone or something was watching him. Shadows danced in the corners of his vision, and the silence of the night felt unnaturally heavy. Maybe she really is a witch, he muttered to himself. Maybe she used her charms to make me feel guilty. That's the only explanation. But deep down, in a part of his heart he had buried long ago, he felt a pang of guilt. Could it be true? Had his mother really sacrificed her legs to save him? He shook his head violently, refusing to entertain the thought. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Abdul found himself on the outskirts of the village. He was tired, hungry, and unsure of where to go next. He sat under a large baobab tree, his head in his hands. Memories of his mother flooded his mind, her laughter when he was a child, the way she used to sing him to sleep, her constant sacrifices to make sure he had food on the table. For a moment, he felt a deep, aching sadness. But then the man's glowing figure flashed in his mind again, and fear took over. No, he whispered to himself. She's lying. She has to be lying. Abdul finally found solace in an uncompleted building at the edge of a busy town. The structure was nothing more than 4 walls and a crumbling roof, but it was a place to hide from the cold and his growing fears. The night was restless, mosquitoes buzzed relentlessly around him, and the hard concrete floor felt like needles stabbing his back. Yet, Abdul slept, his mind a tangle of guilt, anger, and denial. The next morning, Abdul woke up to the sound of footsteps. He froze, holding his breath as a shadow loomed over him. A tall, middle-aged man with a rugged face and a kind expression peered down at him. "What are you doing here, boy?" the man asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and concern. Abdul sat up quickly, his heart pounding. I don't have anywhere to go," he stammered. The man squatted, studying Abdul closely. "No family? No home?" Abdul hesitated, then lowered his gaze. "I'm an orphan," he lied, his voice barely above a whisper. The man sighed deeply, his eyes softening. "What's your name?" "Abdul," he replied. "Well, Abdul, you can't stay here. This place is not safe," the man said firmly. "Come with me. You look like you could use a proper meal and some rest." Abdul hesitated, unsure whether to trust this stranger. But the hunger gnawing at his stomach and the ache in his bones convinced him to follow the man. The man, whose name was Musa, took Abdul to his modest home. It was a small, 2-room apartment in the heart of the bustling town. The smell of freshly cooked beans and fried plantains greeted Abdul as he stepped inside. For the first time in days, he felt a sliver of comfort. Musa handed Abdul a plate of food and watched as the boy devoured it. "You can stay here," Musa said after a while. "But you'll have to work. I run a bus, and I need a conductor. Can you do that?" Abdul nodded eagerly. "I'll do anything, sir. Thank you." The next day, Abdul began his new life as a bus conductor. The job was tough and chaotic. From sunrise to sunset, he shouted out routes, collected fares, and dealt with rude passengers. His voice grew hoarse from constant yelling, and his feet ached from jumping in and out of the moving bus. But Abdul didn't complain. He was grateful to Musa for giving him a roof over his head and a sense of purpose. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Abdul quickly adapted to the hustle and bustle of his new life. He never thought of his mother. He buried every memory of her deep within him, convincing himself that she was just a part of his past, a past he wanted to forget. Years later, time passed swiftly, and Abdul grew from a skinny, scared boy into a hardened young man. The once timid conductor now ruled the bus parks with a booming voice and a commanding presence. Musa noticed Abdul's dedication and hard work. One day, as they sat together after a long day of work, Musa said, "Abdul, you've been with me for years now. You've proven yourself to be reliable. I think it's time you owned your own bus." Abdul's eyes widened. "Really, Baba?" he asked, excitement lighting up his face. Musa nodded. "Yes. I've been saving up for you. You deserve it." A few weeks later, Abdul bought his first bus with Musa's help. The sense of pride he felt that day was unmatched. He painted the bus in bright colors and gave it a name, Oluwa Bless Me. Abdul was no longer a mere conductor, he was now a driver, a boss in his own right. With his newfound status, Abdul began to enjoy the perks of being a bus driver. He made good money and spent it lavishly. He rented a bigger apartment, bought expensive clothes, and surrounded himself with friends who praised his success. But as Abdul climbed the social ladder, he became more arrogant. He looked down on others, forgetting the kindness that Musa had shown him when he was just a helpless boy in an uncompleted building. "Abdul, remember where you came from," Musa would often warn him. "Pride goes before a fall." But Abdul would laugh it off. "Baba, I've worked hard for this. Let me enjoy my life," he'd say dismissively. One night, after a long day of driving, Abdul returned to his apartment. As he lay on his comfortable bed, exhaustion overtaking him, he heard a faint sound. "Abdul." The voice was soft, echoing through the room. Abdul sat up, his heart racing. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaky. There was no response. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan. Abdul shook his head, convincing himself it was just his imagination. But the next night, it happened again. "Abdul." This time, the voice was louder and more distinct. It sent shivers down his spine. He jumped out of bed and turned on all the lights, searching every corner of the apartment. But he found nothing. The voice began to haunt him every night, growing louder and more insistent. "Abdul, remember your mother." Abdul's sleep became restless, his mind plagued by nightmares. He saw visions of his mother, crawling on the floor, her tear-streaked face begging for his forgiveness. One night, as he sat alone in his apartment, the voice returned, but this time it was accompanied by a shadowy figure. The figure was faint, but Abdul could make out the outline of a woman, his mother. "Abdul, why have you forgotten me?" the figure whispered. Abdul screamed, covering his ears. "Leave me alone, you're not real." For months, the haunting memories of his mother refused to leave Abdul. Every night, her voice echoed in his ears, and her face appeared in his dreams. It was as if she was calling him, begging him to come back and make things right. Musa noticed Abdul's change in behavior. The once confident and proud young man had become restless and withdrawn. One night, after dinner at Musa's house, Musa sat Abdul down. "Abdul, something is eating you up. You've been acting strange. Tell me the truth. What is it?" Abdul hesitated. He had hidden his past from Musa for years, pretending to be an orphan with no family. But now, the weight of his guilt was too heavy to bear. He decided it was time to confess. "Uncle Musa," he began, his voice trembling. "I lied to you. I'm not an orphan. I have a mother." Musa's expression hardened, but he said nothing, letting Abdul continue. "I ran away from home years ago. My mother, she was crippled. I hated her for it. I was cruel to her, and when I left, I never looked back. I've not seen her since then," Abdul admitted, tears streaming down his face. Musa was silent for a long moment, his jaw clenched. Then, he exploded. "You mean to tell me that all this time, you've been living in comfort, calling yourself an orphan, while your mother, crippled and helpless, was left to suffer alone? Abdul, how could you?" "I was ashamed," Abdul said, his voice breaking. "I didn't know she..." Shut up, Musa bellowed. You don't know what shame is. You abandoned the woman who gave you life. Do you know what it means to be a mother? Do you know the sacrifices she must have made for you? Abdul hung his head in shame, unable to meet Musa's fiery gaze. Listen to me, Abdul, Musa continued, his voice shaking with anger. You will take me to your village. I want to see this mother of yours. If you refuse, I will make sure you lose everything you've worked for. Do you hear me? Abdul nodded meekly. I'll take you, he whispered. The next morning, Abdul and Musa set off for Abdul's village. The journey was long and silent. Abdul's heart pounded with every mile, dread creeping into his chest. He had no idea what awaited him back home. When they arrived at the village, Abdul barely recognized it. The once familiar paths were overgrown with weeds, and the houses seemed smaller than he remembered. As they walked through the dusty streets, villagers stared at Abdul with a mix of curiosity and disdain. Is that not Abdul? Someone whispered. Yes, the one who abandoned his crippled mother, another replied. Abdul's shame deepened with every step. He led Musa to the spot where his mother's house used to stand, but when they got there, all they saw was rubble. What happened here? Musa asked, looking around in confusion. A woman passing by stopped and shook her head. You're looking for Mama Abdul, aren't you? She asked, her voice tinged with pity. Abdul nodded slowly. Yes, where is she? The woman sighed. Her house collapsed during the rainy season. She was inside when it happened. She didn't survive. The words hit Abdul like a thunderbolt. His legs gave way, and he fell to his knees. No, it can't be, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. How? Why? She was buried a few months ago, the woman continued. We villagers tried to help her when she was alive, but she always said her son would come back for her. She waited for you, Abdul. She waited until the day she died. Abdul let out a heart-wrenching cry, his hands clawing at the dirt. Mama, I'm so sorry, he screamed. The villagers gathered around, watching him weep. Some shook their heads in pity, while others whispered among themselves. See what disobedience and wickedness have caused, one man said. God doesn't sleep, another added. Musa stood silently, his arms crossed. He didn't comfort Abdul, he didn't think the boy deserved it. Instead, he let Abdul wallow in the pain of his regret. The villagers led Abdul to his mother's grave, a simple mound of earth with a wooden cross at the head. Abdul knelt before it, his body trembling with sobs. Mama, he whispered, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I was a terrible son. I was blind to your love and your sacrifices. Please forgive me. He stayed there for hours, pouring out his heart, begging for forgiveness from a woman who could no longer hear him. Musa watched from a distance, his face unreadable. When Abdul finally stood up, his eyes red and swollen, Musa walked over to him. You can cry all you want, Abdul, Musa said coldly. But crying won't bring her back. The only thing you can do now is honor her memory. Change your ways, and let her sacrifice for you not be in vain. Abdul nodded, his heart heavy with remorse. I will, Uncle Musa. I will. Abdul stayed in the village for a few more days, helping the villagers clean up the rubble of his mother's house and giving them money to rebuild it. He also donated to the community, trying to make amends for his years of neglect. When he returned to the city, Abdul was a changed man. He sold his bus and used the money to start a charity for mothers in need, naming it after his mother. Every day, he prayed for her soul, hoping that somewhere, somehow, she could see the man he was trying to become. But the pain of losing her would never leave him. It was a scar he would carry for the rest of his life, a reminder of the price of pride and the cost of neglecting those who love us the most. This is the end. Thank you for watching Brenny Stories.